Today is the day two resurrection scholars acknowledge that natural hypotheses can explain Christianity's historical evidence.
It can be a bit complicated because you can get these sort of hybrid theories, which I would agree with Max are the most plausible alternative explanations.
Max, I'm gonna have to push back on you a little bit, buddy. I just can't see why the evidence would be expected at all on a naturalistic hypothesis.
I'm sure you don't. Stick around, Cameron, and let your own guests teach you some things. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you haven't already, please take a moment to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, and news videos come out. Well, everyone, we're finally here. The last installment in our Once in a While series covering Capturing Christianity's 3.5-hour Loads of Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus epic podcast featuring Dr. Calum Miller and Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. If you want to catch the series from the beginning, tap the playlist above my head. In our last episode, Calum and Max were putting forth potentially irresponsible assertions in the realm of hallucination, trauma, and general psychology. And as it turns out, they weren't quite finished demonstrating a lack of research when it comes to post-bereavement hallucinations.
So just a few of the things that I think make grief hallucinations really improbable in this case is, firstly, they occurred in young people who are far less prone to hallucinations.
As discussed in the previous installment, while the greatest number of grief hallucinations are found in older people, and that's because older individuals experience more loss. In this 1985 study, and affirmed in a 2019 meta-analysis, when the data is adjusted for bereavement occurrences, it turns out the greatest frequency is in the ages of 30 to 39. Now, we don't know the age of the disciples when Jesus died. Peter was very conceivably in his 30s. But this age objection is unsubstantiated and should stop being used.
And cognitive kind of malfunctioning.
Grief hallucinations are not a marker of mental illness or incapacity. They are equally prevalent among those of sound mental health. The studies have shown remarkable concurrence in the percentage of the normal population who've had an experience of one deceased.
Grief hallucinations are usually negative experiences.
Again, the peer-reviewed literature on the subject tells us the exact opposite. A vast majority of people regard their bereavement hallucinations in a positive manner, describing their bereavement hallucinations as comforting or supportive, says this 2018 study. They are mainly felt as pleasant, comforting, and welcome, says this 2020 study.
So they usually don't involve stirring people up with hope or with joy, as we see in the Gospels.
Read the PBHE literature. There's a full spectrum of short-term and long-term emotional effects. Optimism is definitely among them, particularly those who have more than one experience. But I just wanted to add that the joy described is and not a historical fact in question.
They're normally experienced by individuals, and the more people you add to the hallucination at the same time, the more unlikely it gets.
Sure, but the point is that we don't need any groups to have hallucinated to explain any of the historical facts in question, just an individual, as Calum and Max will admit later in the video.
And as I say, they're more likely in people who are lonely, unlike the disciples.
First of all, the idea that the disciples were proximately together in any sense after Jesus' death is and not a recognized historical fact. Second, the studies on PBHE are clear that it is the feeling of loneliness that contributes to the phenomenon, not the number of people around. I'm sure many of you can attest that a crowd can feel lonelier than an empty room.
And normally the appearances stop when the grief stops as well. So normally when people stop grieving, as the disciples would have done once they started believing in the resurrection after the first appearance or so, the appearances would stop because the appearances are directly related to the grief.
You're assuming a lot here. You're assuming this happened to multiple disciples, not necessary to explain the data. You're assuming that it happened multiple times, also not necessary to explain the data.
But we know in the gospel accounts that the appearances didn't stop at that time. They carried on even when the disciples were very happy.
You're assuming a resurrection belief would stop the underlying grief psychology, when the literature tracks cases that can last 4 or more years among subjects who will express that they joyfully look forward to each encounter.
So it has to be a rare kind of grief hallucination.
Yeah.
There is nothing about the historical data that in any way necessitates an unusual PBHE. They happen in around 15% of the grieving population, regardless of age or any psychological condition. There's no reason it had to happen in groups. As you'll admit yourself, it requires only the loss of a close loved one, which presumably would apply to Jesus and his closest disciples. The research shows that the factors you think are unusual do not actually apply. Beyond this, the 2018 study on bereavement hallucination associations with psychological measures, personality, and coping style discovered that the personality domain of openness to experience was also a significant predictor of having bereavement hallucinations, characterized by openness to unusual cognitive and perceptual experiences. A fisherman who gives up his day job to follow someone claiming to be the Son of God is certainly predisposed to be open to unusual cognitive and perceptual experiences. And if Jesus actually was making predictions about his rising from the dead, then the fisherman would not only be open to that experience, they'd be full-on primed to expect it. From where I'm sitting, Peter is a prime candidate for a particularly normal, typical, run-of-the-mill post-bereavement hallucination event. Not an unexpected or rare case at all. But getting back to general explanations for the historical facts about the origins of Christianity, Max admitted that the resurrection case isn't as solid as some Christians proclaim.
If I'm a naturalist, I'm thinking a bodily resurrection is about as unlikely a thing as there could be. So grave robbery by persons unknown.
Or Jesus was never put in a tomb in the first place, but rather unceremoniously dumped, as was standard Roman crucifixion practice.
And then in combination with something like, a very powerful grief hallucination by Peter, and perhaps, some of the others have some kind of experience as well. Perhaps it's like encouraged by the report from Peter. And as time goes on, a sort of story grows up of this experience that they all had together. And, we know that false memories can become cemented over time in a community if a story is told enough times. And yeah, so I guess that's roughly how that would be like, I think, the best shot that a naturalist has. And as I said, I don't think that one can say that that's like outlandishly improbable.
For someone who believes in the resurrection, this is quite an admission. This resurrection expert described very closely what I think happened, and granted that the non-miracle scenario is not improbable. So, Calum, do you agree with your colleague?
I agree with Max that this is possible, or at least that some sort of hybrid is possible, where maybe one person has a grief hallucination and then it sort of spreads in some way to the others. I don't think, in general, hallucinations aren't contagious, but there's at least a possibility that it primed someone else too. I think it's unlikely that all of them had grief hallucinations, but you can maybe, bolster the theory a bit by saying, well, maybe they didn't all have to have grief hallucinations. Maybe some of them just ended up with false memories or ended up in some sort of mass hysteria or something.
Exactly. One person became convinced, and that person started to convince others.
I mean, I guess you're going to have to say that the disciples, their kind of hopes were so set on Jesus as the Redeemer of Israel that they, in a sense, kind of had to find a way to carry on because they'd invested so much of their lives into it up until that point at which he was crucified that in a sense, like all of that was wasted unless they could find a way to say that it was actually a good thing. I mean, I guess that's the sort of line you would have to go down in order to start being able to explain how it has this incredible kind of missionary impulse.
Bang on. Well said. Perhaps it would be in my best interest to just end it here, with the two resurrection evidence experts freely acknowledging that my naturalistic hypothesis is plausible. A huge win. But it's not as though this admission has convinced Calum or Max to give up their dedications to the resurrection. And also, you should be suspect of any quote from an expert that appears to go against the general position of said expert. Even when I do it, context is important. So, What has them so convinced?
In a sense, there's always going to be a possible naturalistic explanation. Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'd say is that, you can build a strong case for the resurrection with a Bayes factor.
Ah, yes. What effort to intellectualize a supernatural claim would be complete without referencing the Bayes factor?
So just quickly, a Bayes factor, as Max said, is essentially a measure of the strength of the evidence. And using probability theory, you can kind of quantify, or you can apply a measure for the strength of some evidence. And the way you do that is by comparing how likely is it that you would get this data or this evidence if the theory is true, and compare that with how likely is it that you would get this data or evidence if the theory is false. And the Bayes factor is just the ratio between them. It kind of makes intuitive sense, because if you think about what good evidence for a scientific theory is, it's basically when a scientific theory predicts something that otherwise would be really, really surprising. And so the question here is, with the resurrection, just how surprising is this data if the resurrection didn't happen? And the strength of the evidence for the resurrection will depend on just how surprising it is.
How surprising is what data? Are you talking about the minimal facts that are promoted by Gary Habermas or Mike Licona? That Jesus died, that people believed he was alive, and now the church exists? If so, the naturalistic proposals both Calum and Max just put forth entirely explain the data. It's completely unsurprising, and they know it.
It's not just enough to talk about, the minimal facts sort of case for the resurrection, these 5 facts or however many you want to include concerning what happened after Jesus' death. I think you have to situate it in a broader context. Or another way to put it would be that if we had the same kind of evidence concerning an empty grave and post-mortem appearances to some random person in antiquity, same strength of evidence, I probably wouldn't be inclined to think that person had been raised.
Totally agree. So what additional data are you gentlemen trying to explain?
And then you have to work out that probability by saying, what's the probability that Jesus' tomb would be found empty if Jesus didn't rise from the dead?
There's a good reason that resurrection scholar Gary Habermas doesn't include an empty tomb as a historical fact to be explained. It is not well accepted by secular historians. It's not corroborated. It's entirely...
Well, that's just going to be the probability that Jesus' tomb would be empty by adding up the probabilities of all the possible explanations of that, like grave robbery, or the disciples robbing it, or the authorities robbing it.
Or that his body was never in a tomb in the first place.
And if all of those are unlikely, then the probability of the empty tomb in general is going to be unlikely.
There's significant evidence that Romans typically left victims on crosses, or tossed them in ditch graves, or other mass graves. Yes, there's evidence for a few exceptions. You can quibble about how often such exceptions occurred, but it's ridiculous to say that the thing that most often happened is in any way unlikely. That's like pretending it's unlikely that someone got fries with their Happy Meal just because it's possible to substitute apple slices. The empty tomb fails to be fact and fails to need an uncommon scenario.
I think maybe if there was no religious background to Jesus' ministry and there was no reason to think God would raise him from the dead, and so the resurrection had a very low prior probability, I would probably agree with Max and say one of these is probably the case. But in the context of Jesus' ministry and the claims he made about himself and everything else we know about him and about God, I think the resurrection theory is far more probable as an explanation.
Wait, what do you think we know about Jesus' ministry? Or what claims he was making about himself? And what's that about God?
So I do think that the case for the resurrection has to also involve a case for theism. And to be clear, you don't need to show that God does exist. You don't need to show it's more likely than not. You just need to show it's like, at least sort of, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
And then when you start to throw in some stuff about, how might God kind of respond to the human situation, and does any particular human figure in history look like a good candidate for the sort of person that God would act through to to bring about some kind of rescue of humanity. Jesus, I think, looks like by far the best candidate.
That's a pretty massive leap from general theism to a God that wants to bring salvation through a person, let alone what kind of person that might be. This seems post hoc.
So yeah, I think that there's a strong case for thinking that the prior probability is moderate at least, and so that's why I just don't think you need the direct evidence, the Bayes factor, to be all that strong.
If you already assume the existence of God and that God wants a salvation plan and that humans need a salvation plan and that Jesus actually said and did the things in the Gospels, only then is the evidence compelling.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, so remember that my claim is that, like, if there are good arguments for the prior probability being very low, then the direct evidence isn't strong enough to overcome that. I think, like, we have enough experience of human beings being, susceptible, especially under conditions where there's, a strong kind of religious atmosphere and particular kinds of expectations surrounding a certain figure, that it just doesn't seem like outlandish to me that you could get some kind of you would need one person to begin the sort of chain reaction, if you will, by having perhaps, let's grant an unusual kind of grief hallucination, which is particularly powerful and vivid and so on. But like, again, nothing that Calum has said has shown, I don't think, that kind of thing is like infinitesimally unlikely. And then, for some of the others to have some kind of experience, or at least to end up convinced in ways that you like certainly can observe, like in the modern world, where a group of people are kind of primed to start believing that a certain thing happened, and over time memories kind of get rewritten, that kind of thing. I just don't think that, if I was a naturalist, I just can't see how I would think that a bodily resurrection is more probable than the kind of thing I've just sketched.
Well said, Max. And you don't even have to be a philosophical naturalist for that scenario to be more probable. Most people who accept the concept of miracles still agree that they're rare and can see that the evidence for this miracle is pretty shaky.
Yeah, I guess I would just clarify. I don't think if the prior probability was infinitesimally small, the evidence would be good enough. Just because the evidence has only a finite probabilistic strength.
The evidence has only a finite probabilistic strength, indeed.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing, which is that, like, I've tried to my best to reflect on how would I view this evidence pertaining to the empty tomb and the appearances if it was just for some other random figure in history about whom we knew nothing else. And I guess the conclusion I come to is that I would just be agnostic about what happened. I would think that something weird happened, but I would probably just leave it at that. And so, yeah, if I'm going to be consistent, then I think I have to say that would be what my position would be about this evidence as it pertains to Jesus, were it not for the background considerations about God and the kind of person Jesus was.
And there you have it. Without already presupposing to somehow know things about Jesus, these scholars would think that something weird happened, but leave it at that. Without pre-believing for entirely unrelated reasons, the evidence for the resurrection is not strong enough for a conclusion. You don't have to take my word for it. Capturing Christianity brought on 2 scholars to explain it for me. I really couldn't have said it better myself. But if you'd like to hear me try, tap on the Paulogia versus Jesus Resurrection playlist on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Later.